Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we're in the middle of a conversation where we're looking at Matthew chapter 23, verse 13, where Jesus stands up like in the temple complex area in front of everybody and calls out the fanciest people in the room, the fanciest people in all of society there, saying the following: "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, and you yourselves don't enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." Like we talked about yesterday, it looks like Jesus is drawing on some prophetic stuff from the Old Testament. This denunciation, which sounds pretty bad in just straight up good old-fashioned American English today, I think is actually much weightier when we understand some of the cultural context. And I also think this is the beginning of a whole bunch of payoffs for things that we've seen developing in terms of ideas and theology. And so I want to go and explore some of that with you today. If you didn't listen to yesterday, you might want to go and do that in order to be caught up. This will make a lot more sense that way. I'm going to have Jeff play some music, and we're going to get after it. None of this should have come as any surprise for people who were paying attention to what Matthew had been saying all along. And some of these Pharisees and teachers of the law who were standing right here were probably in that first group that was dispatched up north to go and investigate these things. Some of them were probably in the groups that were no doubt dispatched to go and investigate John the Baptist and were there for Jesus' baptism. We're like, we don't know what to make of this. And they probably reported back, we seriously need to keep tabs on this thing. We better extend our business trip here. And so then probably also among these Pharisees and teachers of the law who Jesus is calling out in chapter 23 right here would also have been people who were at the Sermon on the Mount and heard it in real time, and we're trying to make sense of it and figure out how to report back how big a problem this thing was. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount is the first of the big five speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured. It's Jesus' first big public anything. People didn't really know what to make of him at this point. Going into chapter 5, you'll recall, they'd heard rumors. They heard that he had a little team that he'd assembled, talk of maybe some miracles, wisdom. That stuff's all exciting. Maybe that he was born in the right way to the right people in the right place and maybe satisfied some of the things that the Old Testament pointed to, but all of that would have been met with subtlety and muted reactions because there's been so many people at that point who would claim to be a Messiah this way or that way. So when he shows up and makes this bold opening proclamation in chapter 5 about how the values of the kingdom are with what we call the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for there's the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth, and so on and so forth. This would have got people's attention, and it would have sent them down this road of questions that we talked about a lot when we were working through the Sermon on the Mount, having to do with like, okay, those values sound great, but we kind of already have a religion, and that God has already done things and made himself known to us. What do we do with all of the stuff that we already have, all the books of the law and history and all of that business, the prophets we already have? So right after Jesus gives those beatitude statements, those values of the kingdom statements, which are like the exact opposite of these 7 woes that he's pronouncing in Matthew 23, where we are right now, right after those beatitudes, he shifts into reassuring the crowd, like, I'm not describing something here that's a departure from what God has been doing. This is the fulfillment, the completion of what God has been doing. So a lot of people would say Matthew 5:17, that verse right after the Beatitudes, is maybe like the pivotal theme verse, the big one for all of Matthew. Don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. But then right after that, and this ties back into Matthew 23, thank you for your patience with this little side jaunt here. I think it's important. He says, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven." All right, that sounds like his teachings right before Jerusalem about like the children and millstones and not leading them astray. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So now we're very much into the big question of, okay, there's a kingdom of heaven. The values sound awesome. It's in keeping with everything we've already done religiously and who God is. How exactly would one get into such a kingdom if hypothetically one were to believe in it, would be the natural next question. And here's the answer in verse 20 of Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus. "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And really, the rest of the answer is the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, which you could summarize as, don't put your faith in world things. Instead, bend the knee to the true king of the true kingdom and embrace the values of that kingdom. But right there in his initial take on getting into the kingdom of heaven, he makes it clear you'd have to do better than the very, very best religious people ever. You would have to do better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Those are precisely the two groups of people, religious leaders, who he references in that passage. And have you noticed that all 7 woes, save one, where Jesus uses the shorthand blind guides to substitute for his description of the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, all the other woes, 6 of the 7, are specifically addressed to the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, the very people Jesus said you would have to be more righteous than, more perfect in your behavior than, in order to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So the payoff with this first woe that I think would have clicked for the attentive original audience member, and that I'm hoping is clicking for us if we're being attentive as well, the first and immediate payoff here is, oh dang, like he said that from the beginning and apparently he meant it. But now he's expanded on it and he's not just saying, oh, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, like that's one way, they're doing pretty well. But if you want to be sure, you'd have to do even better than them. He's talking about a totally separate righteousness that is apart from the law, a totally separate ticket into the kingdom that is apart from these behavioral standards and the legalistic rule-based values of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. What is sandwiched in between what we just looked at in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 and the 7 woes statement we're looking at right now in Matthew chapter 23 is a whole bunch of evidence to suggest that there is no life in this pathway the Pharisees are laying out for you. They're not even in themselves. Therefore, how on earth could they take care of those of you who are standing here listening to me right now, who are putting your trust in their game plan? Don't put your trust in their game plan. If you want to go with their game plan, your exemplary behavior would have to even exceed theirs, and they would say theirs is pretty much perfect. What is perfecter than perfect? Well, it's not perfect, it's insufficient, and instead, again, Jesus is holding out the true route to admission to the kingdom is not one of great personal merit that wows God into just having to have you on his team, but instead it's assuming a right position of humility and weakness and need before a king who is benevolent, and it is his character, not your behavior, that makes admission into this kingdom possible where it would otherwise be impossible. A while back, I asked if you would consider reviewing the show on a podcast platform, preferably iTunes. That seems to be the one that really moves the needle. And a bunch of you did, and they were cool, and they were helpful, and they made a difference, and they encouraged me. So thank you for doing that. That was awesome. We always want the circle to be expanding. We want to be including more people who are just like you or me, people who are a little different than you and me. It's a pretty neat little corner of the internet here where we get to hang out and not all be exactly identical in every way and in every single thing we think. And as weird as it sounds, those podcast reviews go so far in terms of expanding the circle. So thanks for doing that. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.